I'm going to focus on today is panning out a little bit to talk about some of the larger global migration trends that we're seeing around the world, and then a little bit about what's happening in the United States, and then how that connects back to the work of school communities. And so currently we are seeing an unprecedented number of people across the globe who are displaced. There's a lot of forced migration due to violence, conflict, persecution, and just transgression of basic human rights. There's also displacement due to climate change as well. And so at the moment, approximately 1 in 74 people on Earth have been displaced. All signs point to this number continuing to grow as various sociopolitical conflicts around the globe remain unresolved and as new ones take hold. So the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee had predicted in the last year that the question is no longer if forced displacement will exceed 100 million people, but rather when. And then UNHCR went on to state that the when is now. So there are more than 108 million people around the world who are considered forcibly displaced as of June 2023. And again, that number is going to continue to rise. And so there are a lot of different kind of ways to think about statuses and labels of surrounding people who have been forcibly displaced. For example, there are large number of peoples have faced internal displacement, so staying within the country and then having to move to another place within another community within that country. But I'm going to focus today on those who are forced to leave their countries and talk a little bit about refugees. And so of the 108 million people who are forcibly displaced, approximately 35.3 will come to be designated as a refugee, and another 5.4 are currently seeking asylum. And so a refugee is a person who is unable or unwilling to return to their home country because of persecution or well-founded fear of persecution based on class membership, race, ethnicity, political origin, sexual orientation, or religious and or political beliefs. And so the reality is that very, very few people who flee their home country actually make it through all the stages of the process of eventually being designated as a refugee. So those who seek asylum will, leave their home country and move to a secondary country, and then oftentimes remain in a refugee camp, and they might be in that camp for a decade to 2 decades or more. However, while in that camp, they are ostensibly supposed to have the opportunity to apply to UNHCR as an asylum seeker to seek refugee status. So then UNHCR would work with the United States government and various agencies to work through those applications. And so for the very, very few that go through that process, it's going to take approximately 2 years for those who come to the United States to be resettled, because it entails a very complex system where 8 federal agencies are working together in the screening process. Those who are seeking asylum go through at least 6 different security checks and biomedical screenings, and then at least 3 in-person interviews. So it's really just kind of mind-boggling to think about, having to flee one's home country for various reasons, and then go through this very rigorous, often invasive process, but hopefully eventually, be granted asylum and thus able to settle in a country like the United States or elsewhere that is decided to host. And so worldwide, out of the 35.3 million refugees, approximately 40% of refugees are children, young people under the age of 18. In the United States in particular, the US has settled approximately 3 million refugees since 1980 with the creation of the US Refugee Admissions Program. And what we're seeing currently is that there are different trends in where the countries of origins from where refugees are coming from. And so from 2010 to 2020, the highest number of refugees were coming from Myanmar, Iraq, and Bhutan. But by 2022, the countries with the most refugees admitted to the US are coming from Congo, Syria, also Myanmar and Sudan. But then again, this has rapidly shifted as we've seen the conflict take place in Afghanistan and Ukraine, and again, also in Syria. We're also seeing increasing numbers of people seeking refuge from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And so I'm not going to go into all the various statuses such as humanitarian parole, but these various populations will be given different designations by the US government based on their circumstances, and I think some of the history of that particular nation's relationship with the United States. And so on the graph that I've shown you from the Migration Policy Institute on the left, you see over time kind of what the admissions numbers have looked like of refugees into the United States. And so there's been a lot of dips from the peak in 1980 all the way to present day. Under the previous administration, refugee admissions reached a historic low, the lowest number since World War II. However, under the current administration, the ceiling has been raised to 125,000. And those numbers are ticking up really slowly as systems are put back in place to enable agencies to help refugees gain admission and get resettled. And so currently approximately 32,000 refugees have been admitted in the United States in recent times. And so in a little bit of a shift from talking specifically about refugee populations, I want to talk about another immigrant population that we're hearing a lot about in the news and have heard about, in the past decade or so, as there's been different political jockeying over US immigration policy, which, hasn't had any comprehensive reform in quite a long time. But to give you a basic definition of what it means to be unauthorized is an individual who's come into the country without any official government authorization. And so currently there are approximately 11 million undocumented persons living in the United States. And this is down from a peak of 12.2 million in 2007. And this includes individuals who have DACA status or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals status, which gives people who have applied access to 2 years relief from deportation and also provides 2 years authorization for work. And this total also includes those who have temporary protected status. And so unauthorized immigration and unaccompanied minors are also front and center at the media nowadays because there have been upticks in the number of encounters that we're seeing at the US-Mexican border, which rose steeply in 2022. However, I do want to challenge that there are a lot of misconceptions because we do see, the news show images of people waiting at the border. However, research shows that most undocumented immigrants are mostly likely to overstay their visas, that more than 2/3 of them have been in the United States for 10 years or more. So, I would encourage you to continue challenging some of those, stereotypes and those images that we're seeing on the media. There's currently a downtick due to a policy I'll talk about in a little moment here in the number of encounters at the border that's a direct result of a policy shift that we've seen. And so in terms of where undocumented immigrants are arriving from in the United States, oftentimes they've come from Mexico and the Central and South American countries. Increasingly, we're seeing more undocumented immigrants coming from Asian countries and Colombia, Nicaragua, Peru, and Venezuela as well. And so this is all to say that issues of migration, forced displacement is a huge global issue, and it's predicted that it's going to be continuing in the years to come, which will be shifting, the demographics of your states, your communities, and your school communities. And so it's a lot of opportunity for advocacy and to seek policy change if that's something that's important to you. And so really, honestly, following immigration policy is akin to, like trying to drink from a fire hydrant. There have been so many shifts over the last 6+ years. And, even for me, someone who follows immigration policy changes and trends, it's a lot to keep up with. So for you as educators and school leaders, I'm going to share some resources in a little bit that hopefully will make it easy for you to notice and think about policy trends and changes, so you can think about how that might impact your practice and your context of work. And so I'm not going to talk about all the immigration policies that have been proposed and taken place, but I'm just going to highlight a few from the past 6 years. And so across the political parties, there are definitely some similarities, but also some stark differences. And so under the previous presidential administration, there was a return to broad immigration enforcement. And so prior to the previous administration, Immigration and Customs Enforcement focused on targeting individuals who maybe were accused of a serious crime, maybe a felony. However, the previous administration kind of removed that consideration and was trying to enforce immigration law around the border regions, but also into the interior of the country. The previous administration had also instituted a zero tolerance policy, which is the tragedy that we've read much about, which is essentially the separation of families from their children. Over 5,000 families were separated, and there was some support to show that it was done intentionally, and that families are still at this point trying to be reunited. And there's a task force aimed at trying to reunite those families. During the pandemic, we also saw the Migration Protection Protocols, also known as the Remain in Mexico program, which meant that asylum seekers needed to wait in the country, their second country, such as Mexico, while they applied for asylum. So they weren't admitted to the United States while going through that process. So they weren't able to come into the United States. There were other, rules such as Title 42, public health order, which also kept asylum seekers from coming into the United States and having to wait abroad as well. And so in terms of current policy, we're seeing that there is a return to narrowed aims for immigration enforcement. And so we've kind of shifted back to the administration kind of trying to enforce law against individuals accused of serious crimes. They've picked up the Family Reunification Task Force and trying to reunite separated families. The Migration Protection Protocols is a bit stalled at the moment. I need to follow up on that more closely to see where that's at. But we do know that most recently, just 2 months ago, Title 42 was ended, which had prevented asylum claims from moving forward based on the argument that, COVID, the pandemic conditions made it unsafe for people to come into the country. As I noted earlier, the admission ceiling has raised, and then more individuals from temporary protected status are able to get temporary protected status designation as well. So there's an expansion of that. And so kind of to wrap up where we're at with current policy, there's a new Title 8, which is in place, which actually means that policy is reverting to the pre-pandemic ways of processing individuals and, how deportation occurs. However, there are some, kind of strings attached to, what happens if an individual decides to cross without authorization. So if someone decides to cross without authorization, that then makes them ineligible to apply for asylum. And so things are getting a little bit trickier again. Removal proceedings are being fast-tracked as well. So that's currently happening with large-scale federal policy. But on the plus side, in terms of asylum seekers and those who are going to be designated as refugees, the current administration recently instituted the Welcome Corps, which is an opportunity for private community sponsorship of refugees. So this is something new to help kind of, encourage the resettlement of those who have been displaced and are seeking to build their lives anew or need to build their lives anew in the United States. And we're seeing also that this program is expanding into higher education, which is really exciting. So, universities are their own, communities with, housing resources and food and supports like counseling services, exercise facilities, and things like that. So hopefully higher education institutions will step up and help in the resettlement process and welcoming our new neighbors. So what this means for those of you who are working either at the district level or schooling level is that, of course, the demographics of your schools and districts are continuing to change, but we know that there are a lot of important legal protections and rights in place for immigrant students, whatever their status. And so some of the famous cases to know would include Lau v. Nichols from the 1970s that states that English learners are entitled to equal service like any of their non-EL peers. Castaneda versus Pickard requires that schools do their best to provide sound instructional approaches. And then the Refugee Act of 1980, Public Law 96, 2012, states that any child who is a refugee is to be enrolled in school within 90 days, if not sooner. And so we know that there's a lot that happens as refugee families are being resettled into a new nation, community, school, and in terms of, getting these students enrolled. Community-based organizations, for example, can be really important in bridging those gaps and understanding about U.S. schooling norms or within enrollment. And so those of you in schools might want to consider, if you're not already working with community-based organizations, to seek out those services in your local community. And then last but not least, Plyler versus Doe, which was a Supreme Court decision that states that every child, regardless of their immigration status, is entitled to a free public K through 12 education. And so moving from sort of like the legal perspective down to you at the schooling level and at the community level, kind of where to start. This is a lot, as the previous presenter said, this is a lot of information to take in. There's the swirl of changing immigration policies, but in terms of the daily work and ensuring that students receive the high quality education that they're entitled to, some of the key things to focus on first and foremost include creating safe classrooms. We know that, a lot of the students, maybe from refugee backgrounds or even undocumented immigrant backgrounds, can come to the classroom with either interrupted formal education or no formal education. They may be arriving with forms of invisible trauma or either visible trauma as well. So, the priority there is to create safe classrooms and to continue building those community connections to enhance and facilitate in integration. And then from there, focusing on quality learning. And so The things, though, that to make this happen is to engage authentically with students, fostering intentionally discussions of hard questions, and then thinking about ways to honor the cultural, religious, and linguistic heritages of your students and your families. And what this is going to mean is becoming comfortable as an educator and learning about various cultures and various religions, and speaking about the conflict that's occurring in ways that make students both from the immigrant origin backgrounds and those or their non-immigrant peers having those those conversations together to enhance learning. And so I know we just have a few more minutes, and so I'll kind of work through this really quickly. But for practitioners, normalizing immigration statuses and humanizing and contextualizing immigration is really important, as is creating status-blind schooling norms. So thinking about how do we not label, a student as a refugee student throughout the course of their K through 12 schooling career, making sure that the classrooms are able to be places of risk where students are learning more about their identities and able to speak up about them. And then importantly for teachers and other PK through 12 educators, doing what you can to signal that your classroom, your school, your community are safe spaces for those students to share, and making those signs of support visible to them, whether it's on your door and the hallway with, a kind of a mural, for example, with welcoming signs in myriad languages. And so to close, these are a few resources that I have found to be really beneficial for me in thinking about my practice and my research and doing professional development. So the Teachers as Allies is great for working with undocumented immigrant populations and engaging in reflective exercises to think about the ethical dimensions too of educational practice. And so Teachers as Allies is a great one. The basics on education law, what educators need to know about immigration law is fantastic. Any of these are great resources, and you're going to get a copy of the presentation down the road. So I hope you'll look them up. And then finally, additional resources include, of course, the Immigrant Learning Center. I perused the website and there's a treasure trove there to explore. We have also, the National Immigration Law Center, Brikes, United We Dream, if you want to get daily texts on what's happening in immigration policy and fact sheets. Coloring Colorado, Learning for Justice are also fabulous resources with various videos to humanize immigrant origin people's stories and experiences. And there are also some practical guides. And then I know we're out of time, so I will close with a hearty thank you and much appreciation for being invited to this session today.
Emily, that was very, very informative. As you very well know, keeping up with what's going on in immigration is at best tricky and
yes,
unpredictable. But as you said, there's not been real immigration reform in like 3 decades.
Right.
But one thing I wanted to touch on, you mentioned that, so we know that there are record encounters at the border, over 2 million in the past year, for instance. But most people who are here undocumented overstay their visas.
Correct.
Can you just talk a little bit about how intertwined unauthorized migration is in sort of US history? It's something that's always been a part of it, right?
Sure, it's been part of it for a long time. And so we can think about going back to the, Bracero program. I mean, it's been decades and decades since the 1800s, depending on the industry, right? And so we've seen, immigrants from China brought to the United States to work on the railroad and helping get the railroad system up and running, to the Bracero program, or Mexican immigrant labor was brought in to work in agriculture, predominantly in California and the Californian fields. However, we did see, kind of like we're seeing today, shifts in immigration policy. And so when we see that anti-immigrant rhetoric, pop up, those who maybe are unauthorized, we see a ramping up of sort of the deportation regime. And then that creates sort of this cycle where we see the dangerous tropes about, unauthorized populations taking jobs, but we know that that is not the case at all. And so the undocumented immigrant population is deeply, deeply enmeshed in both the history and in our workforce. They're so critical to hospitality and any number of industries that we depend on as a country. We know that they're incredibly valuable and contribute to the richness of our cultures here.
And it's so intertwined that even the IRS has a way for undocumented workers to pay taxes.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do, which is also a really kind of prevalent trope that the undocumented population doesn't pay taxes, but they make enormous economic contributions. And yes, the IRS will find ways to make sure that those payments occur. So they do. They make enormous social and economic contributions.
Dr. Emily Crawford-Rossi, thank you so much for joining us from all the way in Missouri and for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Have a great day.